Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome. Noswaith dda, croeso i chi gyd. It's good to be able to welcome you to our presentation and discussion this evening, our digital showcase. My name is Colin Reardon, and I'm the President and Vice Chancellor of Cardiff University. As you'll just have heard, the digital showcase this evening is being recorded, and when it's over, we'll send you the link after the event, and you're welcome to share that. And I hope you will, because it's important and interesting stuff that we're discussing this evening. So massive thank you, deall, to all of you for joining us this evening. You're here as part of the Cardiff University, including alumni, staff, donors and friends of the university. And through your presence, you're supporting the learning and research of the university. And that learning and research very much includes understanding how our minds work and investigating psychology and development and a whole range of areas in that field. And we have actually put an awful lot of time and money and investment into this area. And our aim is not just to do research for the sake of it, although that's very, very important, but to work out how we can then influence therapies and help people and move from understanding how our minds work, how the brains work, to how we can help people and how we can help society, so that the knowledge that we gain, the knowledge that we create has real-world implications for people as soon as possible. Now, we're very proud of our research. We're proud to have been ranked second nationally for the impact of our research, and we're among the top 5 universities in the UK for research excellence. So you've come to the right place to hear all about our subject tonight. It's very apt that this week is Neurodiversity Celebration Week, because tonight's event showcases our research on one particular neurological developmental condition, developmental coordination disorder, DCD, otherwise known as dyspraxia. Many of you will know this condition as that. We're learning an awful lot about its biology, but we aim to use that knowledge to make recommendations for clinicians and educators in supporting children and young people living with the condition. So we are going to be having 2 speakers this evening. Dr. Catherine Purcell, a psychologist by training, who is a reader within the School of Healthcare Sciences, and the associate lead for the population health research theme, and that's in the College of Biomedical and Life Sciences. Catherine has research interests in perceptual motor coupling in children and adults with developmental disorders. And we're also going to be joined by Dr. Jen Keating, who is a postdoctoral research associate based within the School of Psychology this time, and her interests are on understanding and identifying factors that may affect healthy brain and behaviour development in children. Now, I'll be asking them to start their talks in a moment, but and after that, we will have an opportunity for questions and answers. But I also want to let you know that we do have a guest joining us as well later on, Andrea Meek. And Andrea is the mother of a child with dyspraxia, and she's going to share her own and her daughter's experience and insight. Andrea is a Cardiff University alumna and a research assistant in the National Centre for Mental Health here at the university. And she's specifically here tonight because she's mum to Maisie, who is 12 years old and was diagnosed with developmental coordination disorder, DCD, when she was 5 years old. So when Maisie isn't taking part in Cardiff University research projects, she enjoys big roller coasters, playing Roblox, whatever that is, and is a big Disney fan. She has a talent for art, anything creative, and would like to become an animator. Great ambition. So I look forward to hearing more about that later on. We have received some questions in advance generally on this topic, but as you listen to the presentations, please do share your questions. There's a Q&A box that you can type them into, and we'll try and answer as many as time allows. And if we don't get round to your question, we will follow it up later. So do ask as many questions as you would like. We'll get round to them all at some point, even if we can't quite fit them all in this evening. We are going to keep very much to time. We've got until 6 o'clock. But so I think actually what we should do now is to start with the first presentation. So I'm going to ask Catherine to start us off, and she will then subsequently hand over to Jen. So Catherine, over to you.
Thank you very much, Colin. I'll just share my screen. Thank you very much, Colin. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Prynawn da pawb a croeso. As Colin mentioned, my name is Catherine Purcell, and although I'm a psychologist, I work in occupational therapy in the School of Healthcare Sciences. I've been conducting research in the field of DCD for over 10 years, and this afternoon, myself and my colleague Jen will be presenting a study that we've just completed that explored a particular area of the brain in children with developmental coordination disorder. We'll be using images and videos throughout the presentation, which we have permission to use. Before I hand over to Jen to talk about the specific project, I wanted to talk a little bit about developmental coordination disorder. So developmental coordination disorder, or DCD, is sometimes called dyspraxia, and it's a common neurodevelopmental disorder that impairs a child's ability to learn essential motor skills and perform everyday activities efficiently. So for example, getting dressed, tying shoelaces, using cutlery, handwriting, playing games and sports, or riding a bicycle. The motor difficulties associated with DCD have quite significant negative impacts on school performance, social interactions, leisure activities, and then in emerging adulthood on vocational choices. Owing to repeated and often unsuccessful attempts to perform common daily motor tasks, people with DCD often withdraw from participating in physical and social activities and often develop mental health concerns. These typically include high levels of anxiety or depression, as well as low self-esteem, poor self-concept, and loneliness. While some people may mistakenly consider DCD a minor motor problem in childhood, evidence clearly demonstrates that DCD has long-lasting and far-reaching effects, which significantly affects quality of life across the lifespan. DCD occurs across cultures, races, and socioeconomic statuses, and the prevalence of DCD in children is estimated at around 5 to 6%, and that means that roughly 1 child in every classroom may have DCD, and more than 100 million children worldwide are living with DCD. We don't know what causes DCD, and diagnosis is based on behavioural assessment, and there is certainly no cure for DCD. But if we as researchers can help to better understand the underlying mechanisms of DCD, we may be able to make recommendations for intervention. So there is, however, a lot that we don't know, but we do know that children with DCD find imitating actions and producing actions, whether that be fine motor tasks such as handwriting or gross motor tasks such as riding a bike, hard. We also know that there's an area in the brain called the mirror neuron system that activates whenever we watch someone else performing an action, when we perform an action ourselves, or when we imagine an action being performed. So the mirror neuron system seems to respond to human movement, but not to non-biological movement. So for example, trees blowing in the wind. While previous brain imaging studies have found decreased activation in this mirror neuron system when children with DCD observe or imitate actions, other brain imaging studies, however, have observed no significant differences in activity in this mirror neuron system between children with and without DCD. Up until now, however, no study has looked at whether differences seen in the mirror neuron system in DCD are specific to action observation, action execution, or if both processes are affected in children with DCD. And up until now, no studies examined the association between fine and gross motor actions and this mirror neuron system activity in typically developing children, let alone children with DCD. And that's why we undertook the COMB study. And COMB stands for Coordination, Movement, and the Brain. And I'm now going to hand over to Jen to take you through the study in more detail.
Thank you, Catherine. If you don't mind going to the next slide, please. So as Catherine mentioned, we were interested in measuring the mirror neuron system activity during the COMB study, and how we were measuring this mirror neuron system was using electroencephalography, or EEG, which involves measuring electrical activity in the brain. So as you can see in this image here, this is one of our participants modeling our EEG caps, which involves wearing this cap on their head, and it has lots of electrodes attached to it. And that helps us read sort of the electrical activity that's happening in their brain. And because we were interested in the mirror neuron system, we were interested in a particular band of EEG oscillations known as the mu rhythm, which is active over the central part of our brain, or the sensory motor region. If you don't mind going to the next slide, please, Catherine. Thank you. So we had 23 children with a diagnosis of DCD and 33 children without a diagnosis of DCD, aged between 8 and 12 years, come and visit us for one session in the lab at Cardiff University Centre for Human Developmental Sciences. And during their visit, we had them take part in the movement assessment battery for children, which is an assessment of motor ability. So it involves asking children to, balance walking along a line, throwing bean bags, putting pegs in pegboards, and different activities. We also used the Wechsler abbreviated scale of intelligence to measure their cognitive abilities. And while the children were carrying out these tasks, we asked their parents to complete some questionnaires measuring their attention skills and also their social communication skills, which we used as a proxy for their autistic traits. You can go to the next slide, please. And we were also interested in looking at their motor abilities as we were measuring their brain activity using EEG. So first of all, we were just interested in taking a measure of their resting brain activity when they weren't performing any actions or watching any actions. So we asked the children to sit with their eyes open and their eyes closed for 30 seconds at a time. We repeated that 3 times. And then, as Catherine mentioned before, we were interested in looking at children both observing actions and performing actions or executing actions themselves. And we were also interested in looking at their gross motor skills and also their fine motor skills. So in the next few slides, I'll take you through what some of the stimuli looked like. So first of all, they watched videos of someone reaching out and tapping a red square in front of them. So this was observing a gross motor action. And then sometimes the children were prompted to reach out and tap a similar red square on the table in front of them. And then for our fine motor task, we had children watch a video of someone tracing a flower shape using a red pen. And then sometimes the children were prompted then to draw that same flower shape on a table in front of them. And finally, we were interested in including a baseline measure which shouldn't activate the mirror neuron system. So as Catherine mentioned before, previous research has suggested that these mirror neurons activate towards biological or human motion. And other researchers have found that patterns such as kaleidoscopes or sort of these kind of moving shapes shouldn't activate this mirror neuron system. So we also sometimes had children just watch a video of this kaleidoscope pattern, which we wanted to use as sort of a baseline measure or a control through which we could then compare how the mirror neuron system activated during these observation and these execution conditions. You can go to the next slide. So what we found was that the mirror neuron system did activate differently in children with DCD. We did find that across the action observation and the action execution conditions, children with DCD showed less mirror neuron system activation compared to the children who didn't have a diagnosis. But what we also found that was interesting is that the mirror neuron system seemed to activate during this kaleidoscope condition for children with DCD. And what was even more intriguing is that we didn't find any differences for the children during that resting state activity. So when we were asking them to just sit with their eyes open or their eyes closed. So it seemed that there was something in the kaleidoscope patterns that we were asking the children to watch that seemed to be activating the mirror neuron system for children with DCD that wasn't happening for children without DCD. So we've been thinking about what some of these findings might mean. So first of all, our research does support the hypothesis that the mirror neuron system does activate differently in DCD, but also that the mirror neuron system might be more activated more globally or mightn't be as fine-tuned for individuals with DCD. So for example, the way we found that the kaleidoscope activated for this non-biological motion. So this might mean that as children with DCD are observing the world around them, their mirror neuron system might be activating to all kinds of motion and not specifically biological motion as we might expect it to. And if we think about a learning environment, in classrooms are very busy and dynamic environments with lots of motion going on, it might mean that might add extra difficulties for children with DCD to learn new motor tasks. So it might be an idea for children to learn new motor tasks in sort of calmer and less dynamic environments. And the findings that we have found with this study might also reflect disruption to the dorsal stream, or that brain pathway that's involved in sort of localizing objects in space as well. I'm going to go to the next slide. So what are we planning to do next? So we're thinking about kind of looking at follow-on funding to look at potentially mirror neuron system training interventions. So for example, action observation interventions, adapting previous interventions that might be used with individuals who have experienced strokes. We also want to replicate our findings across other neuroimaging methods, so fMRI or MEG as well. And another piece of work that we're doing as part of the COMB study is we're also looking at the sensory processing difficulties of children with DCD. And we're kind of currently analysing those results as well to see how they might respond differently to sort of sensory experiences in their own environment. And I think that's passing back to Catherine now.
Thank you very much, Jen. That's great. So thank you very much for listening to the talk around the study. I guess I just finally wanted to thank the other members of the research team, so Ross Vandervert, Sarah Gerson and Catherine Jones. I also wanted to give a special thanks to the Waterloo Foundation. The Waterloo Foundation are the only UK funder that specifically supports research in children with DCD. Without their funding, this project and many other projects relating to DCD simply wouldn't be possible. So thank you very much to the Waterloo Foundation. Finally, it's easy sometimes to talk about lab-based research in a way that removes the essence of the community that we're conducting research with. So before we go to the Q&A panel, I wanted to remind all of us that behind all of this science that typically focuses on things that people with DCD find difficult, all young people and adults with DCD have fantastic strengths that should be celebrated. I asked one young person with DCD to share their favourite things about Wales, and I thought I would share this with you.
Beaches and seasides and ice cream and Welsh cakes, mountains and daffodils and rugby and rabbit, walking adventures with my family. These are a few of my favourite scenes. Rainy weather, massive castles, coaches when I'm sad. I simply remember these while she sings, and then I feel so sad.
It just leaves me to say Happy Neurodiversity Celebration Week, and thank you for listening.
Well, thank you very much, and what a lovely way to finish the talk there. That was really nice to see that. Thank you. I'm going to introduce Andrea Meek now, who I did mention earlier on. So Andrea's Maisie's mum, and I just thought, Andrea, maybe you'd just like to say a few words about how you got involved, perhaps what you've learned. Has it been useful? I mean, clearly the research itself is useful so we can help more people. Any thoughts on that?
I mean, we are quite lucky as a family with a dyspraxic child, as our local dyspraxia group is actually run by Catherine. And it's been a fantastic resource for us as a family. So us getting involved in the research really kind of came through there. You know, all of the information that was sent through to us, and it was all in easy read format for Maisie. So that was really good. She could understand what, you know, she was getting involved in, and she was happy to go ahead with it. And I think, you know, as a researcher, I know that how difficult it is to get participants in any research. So, you know, and as a parent, there's not a lot of kind of parent-based research outputs that are produced. So for me, I was really keen to be involved in something that, you know, would feed back to parents and would be useful for Maisie to be involved in also, and just to learn something a little bit more about how she works.
That's great. Thanks very much. And you're absolutely right. Getting human participants in research is difficult. So we're extremely grateful that you're taking part, and you and Maisie are taking part. So if I could come to Catherine, perhaps to start with, what would you say, Catherine, to the parent of a child who's recently been diagnosed? I mean, what can they expect?
I mean, I think, thanks, Colin. I think I'd probably say, I think it's really important to give all children, actually, but particularly children that perhaps find motor tasks quite difficult, lots of opportunities to try new things so that they can find out what they enjoy, because motivation is so important. So I think it's about building on strengths. So, you know, when you find something that a child enjoys, then really building on that. I think also probably, you know, fatigue can be quite challenging for children with DCD and adults. I think they work so hard just to kind of keep everything together, particularly in a kind of a school environment. So I think, given that, you know, keeping them really fit, you know, really promoting kind of physical activity to try and mitigate some of that fatigue is probably something else I would say. I don't know, Andrea, if you've got any advice as a mum.
I think that, you know, when you have a child that's diagnosed, Maisie was diagnosed at 5 years old, and it can be really overwhelming, I think, and it can be really easy to panic because sometimes diagnoses don't come with the positive aspects of a condition. So I think it's about not panicking. I think it's about arming yourself with really good resources, speaking to dyspraxic people, and speaking to parents that can give you tips. You know, one of the things I found useful was doing an exercise that just talked about what people found helpful, and then you go away and you try the tips, and if they work for you, then that's great, you keep them, and if they don't, you just try them another way until you find the way that, you know, works for your young person. Yeah, and you know, if there are good groups out there and good information, so it's about kind of joining those, I think, and just supporting your child in any way that you can, really.
Thanks for the questions. Keep them coming in. We'll come on to them and try and get through as many as possible. There's one or two others that we've had pre-submitted. So, what's the long-term prognosis and implications for children with DCD?
Should I have a go at that one first? I mean, I think it's.
Well, I realise.
I think up until, you know, not that long ago, to be honest, there was this kind of assumption that you know, children grow out, somehow hit 18 and they grow out of DCD, and of course that isn't the case. There's very compelling evidence now that, you know, kind of 80% of children will go on to be adults with DCD and dyspraxia. So I think. I suppose the difference, I guess, in adulthood is that you probably have more choices, I guess, about the things that you take part in and the things that you don't. So I think that's slightly harder when you're a school age, and there are expectations around, you know, PE and all kinds of things that children with DCD typically find quite challenging. There's actually quite limited research in adults, comparatively, in adults with DCD. It is increasing, but the research tends to focus more on transition or on specific activities like kind of driving. And unfortunately, this probably reflects the lack of statutory services for adults with DCD, and also the difficulty in securing research funding to conduct research with adults with DCD, I think, as well. So yeah, I think we did a study a couple of years ago looking at, I've done a couple of studies actually involving adults with DCD, but one looked at falls, and it was really intriguing that the types of strategies that adults put in place to prevent falls. So particularly women with DCD, so they tend to avoid things like high heels. But adults generally with DCD, in terms of falls, talked a lot about avoiding slippery surfaces, or you know, holding on to something as they're kind of walking in very busy environments. So I think strategies are often developed during childhood, and they're often carried through to adulthood, and built on and adapted in adulthood, I think.
One of our, just on that topic, one of our students has asked whether there's been any input from neurodivergent adults into the study, I guess into the design of the study. Has that been possible?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So there wasn't in this comb study, but previous research that I've done certainly has involved input from the DCD community. And actually we've developed with the DCD community kind of top tips for children. So with children with DCD, we co-produced that, and also co-produced 4 booklets for adults with DCD. So one around activities of daily living, which is the biggest booklet, one around higher education, one around employment, and one around relationships, and that was true co-production. So that wasn't us, that was entirely adults with DCD sharing their strategies and what they've used successfully in adulthood. The DCD UK committee, which I'm a member of, research committee, we're looking at the moment to recruit a PPI group, so for DCD research across the UK. So hopefully that will help again in terms of making sure that voice is heard, because I think it is very important.
That's really helpful, and in fact that answers one of the questions that we've got there from Anna, and I guess we'll be able to share the links to those resources, so that I hope that'll be helpful to people. On the from Penny there on support for students, we do offer support for students through our student support and well-being service. So we offer a diagnostic service and then support and adjustment subsequent to that. And again, we can share links to that. Let's comment. We've got some interesting ones coming in, but there's one or two on environments. How important is environment, and how can design of environment help with that?
Brilliant. Shall I start off, and then I might hand over to Andrew again for a minute? I think it'd be really useful to get your perspective, if that's okay. And of course, Jen, jump in if there's anything you want to add. So I think environment, it very much depends on the activity, to be honest. In general, I think uncluttered environments are a really good idea. So whether that be a classroom environment, whether it be any kind of environment, to be honest, and particularly given the current findings that we presented this evening. So particularly when someone with DCD is trying to learn something new, I think uncluttered environments is sensible. I think there are also kind of other things just in terms of everyday life. So things like making sure that steps are well marked, just to help with depth perception. Things like rails to hold on to, making sure that paths aren't muddy. Lighting's really important. Avoiding dual tasking. So kind of things like that, I think. But Andrea, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think I agree with all of those. I think as a parent, even the environment of the child's bedroom needs to be, walkways need to be clear. Not always easy when you've got a kind of teenager come up that naturally dumps everything on the floor, but it's about kind of being organized and the environment being suited to the individual. In the workplace, because we do have several interns at Cardiff University as part of Project Search that are identified as dyspraxic, and what we found is that things like end of row seating is better. Sometimes open plan is not necessarily the best environment because there's a lot of echoing, a lot of noise that carries a lot of distractions. Using things like reminders on your desk, just physical reminders, and also timed reminders for specific tasks work really well. And we also use those in the house. We have a lot of alarms that are set as reminders for things. And this is just about kind of, I think, adapting things to the individual need, because everybody will be individual. So it's just about working what works best for that person. Thanks.
And Jen, I don't know if this is one you could come in on, which is, are there links between, there's a couple about diagnosis, but first of all, are there links between other types of perhaps related or similar conditions, dyslexia and dyspraxia and ADHD? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so it's actually really quite common that DCD also co-occurs with kind of other neurodevelopmental conditions, particularly ASD and ADHD. the prevalence of ADHD is about 50% kind of co-occurring. So it's actually really common. And it's almost rare that you would find an individual who has DCD and sort of doesn't experience any other difficulties as well.
Interesting. That's really interesting to hear. Thank you. And there's one on what are the criteria? Is there a minimum amount of criteria that indicates a possible dyspraxia diagnosis? I mean, these things, it must be difficult to figure out how to do this. So how does one go about that, the diagnosis?
So I'll start off with that one. So in the UK, clinicians typically use the DSM-5, so the DSM-5, which has 4 diagnostic criteria. So the first is that the onset of movement difficulties must be present early in life. The second is that they can't be better explained by any underlying neurological condition, such as CP or cerebral palsy or anything like that. The third is that there must be suitable opportunity for skill acquisition, for learning skills, and that it must be that the difficulties must be persistent across settings and interfere with activities of daily living. So that's kind of very roughly from memory the diagnosis. I haven't missed anything. The diagnostic criteria and diagnosis in childhood typically takes place through kind of children's services, but would always be signed off by a medical professional to meet that criteria around no known underlying neurological conditions. It's much harder in adulthood because there aren't adult services. There's no statutory services, so adults often get picked up in university, for example, or paying privately for an assessment in the UK. So I think in adulthood, the diagnostic criteria, there isn't different diagnostic criteria for adults, but adults typically, find it much harder to get a diagnosis if they're not kind of in university or get picked up at university. So that's kind of the process.
There's a question there about if there is a child in school still, what's the first thing to do? GP or?
Yeah, either GP or speak to the ELNCO. So every school will have an additional learning needs coordinator. So raise it with them and go to the GP. Absolutely, yeah.
And as I say, we will be. I mean, all the questions that you're asking for, where to go to find out things. We'll share all those links and all that advice there. And somebody's asked Andrea whether you found that the school supportive, the GP to be supportive of Maisie.
I think that there was originally some confusion over some misconceptions about what DCD actually was. There's still misconceptions that it is just clumsy child syndrome. And the research shows that it is much wider than that, and it is, more wider reaching. It very much, in our experience, depends on the teacher, and and how good the school are at developing person-centered plans and putting that support in place. But it varies widely. Maisie moved from quite a small Welsh medium junior school last year to a very large Welsh medium comprehensive school, and that transition was very interesting. It was about going back in as a parent and trying to kind of get Maisie to advocate for herself as well in how her dyspraxia affects her, rather than having people kind of make assumptions of her. So it's a very interesting navigating school experience has been very interesting.
Thanks. That's good. There's one here on there's lots coming in, so that's great. And as I say, if we don't get around to answering all of them, we will get back to you. But what are the ambitions for the COMB study and potentially future studies? And people are asking also about adult studies. And you've already said how difficult it is to. There are these, I don't think people are always aware that in research there are kind of Cinderella subjects almost. and it can be difficult to get funding for certain areas. So we've already talked about that, but what's the ambition for the COMB study and for future studies? And do we at the university work closely with the NHS and school systems to roll out the findings and the best practice?
Yeah, so I think as I sort of started to talk about, we're kind of thinking now about what we want to take to the next step. And I think what we're thinking about, first of all, is sort of exploring that dorsal stream pathway in DCD, which we've kind of found mildly implicated in this study. And there's kind of other previous work has shown that the dorsal stream, or that sort of where pathway in the brain might be involved. So that is kind of a potential follow-on study. The other things that we're thinking about is potentially looking at sort of mirror neuron system sort of training interventions, and whether we can sort of work using kind of adapting different interventions to potentially kind of sort of almost fine-tune the mirror neuron system in DCD so that it mightn't activate as globally potentially. So I think that's sort of our immediate next steps for this study. Don't know if Catherine has more to say about that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's lots of directions and lots of things going on. So I've got a large grant application in at the moment. It's an international grant, actually looking at active travel amongst. So going back to this idea of physical fitness, and children with DCD certainly tend to prefer to do physical activity individually rather than team activities. So one kind of underexplored area might be something like active travel. So we're looking at whether we can get funding to understand whether children with DCD are actively traveling, and if not, then how that could be promoted. So I mean that I think would be a fantastic study if we got that funding. I think the biggest challenge with, as I've mentioned, with research in this field, and you're right, Colin, unfortunately, DCD is considered as one of the Cinderella kind of neurodevelopmental disorders, despite its prevalence being substantially higher than a lot of the other neurodevelopmental disorders. So for me, because I'm a DCD researcher, it always surprises me how hard trying to get funding is, but it genuinely is, and I think that is the biggest barrier without a doubt. I have a program of research around this field, as do many other researchers across the UK, to be honest, and we all know each other very well and work together both nationally and internationally. And I think what we're looking to do is we've got an international society now that I'm one of the directors of, and we're looking to really both try and do more impactful research at an international level in order to raise the profile of DCD, I guess, but also ensure that research is helping to advocate for DCD as well. So that's a kind of a long-term goal, but we're very determined, and I'm sure we'll get there. But yeah, I think one of the things that we're very keen to do with the UK DCD committee is to start engaging with people across the UK with DCD to try and find out what their priorities are. And we hosted at Cardiff last year the DCD UK conference, which was very, very well attended. And at the end of that conference, we had a kind of a bit of a workshop where we asked attendees. It was an academic conference, and we asked attendees, what would you like? What do you think we should be focusing on as a UK DCD community, research community? And actually the overwhelming response was we need to ask people with DCD. So I think that is our next step. So it's just how we coordinate that and try and fund that is what we're working on at the moment.
So many interesting questions coming in. Somebody's asked how we pick up these this issue at universities. It's usually, I can answer that one, it's usually a tutor will notice that somebody's having difficulty, but there's no obvious reason why that should be, and so they then refer them, which is obviously great. There's an interesting question on, are there any resources on music, teaching music in this context? If you need to come back to that later, that's
that's fine. It's a really interesting question, actually. I don't directly know the answer, but I do know the evidence, some of the evidence, the research evidence around rhythm, which is kind of very linked, I'm guessing. Music isn't really my field. I'm completely tone deaf, so I'm probably not the right person to ask this, but I do know the research evidence around kind of rhythm in DCD, and children with DCD find it very difficult actually to keep a rhythm. So that'd be a really interesting area to explore further, and whether that can be, I think sequencing is quite difficult for children with DCD, which I think also would make, probably means that for some children with DCD, music might be quite challenging because it's often quite sequenced and there's clearly a rhythm involved, and the previous evidence has suggested that those things are quite challenging. Andrew, have you got any experience with Maisie?
No. I'm honest, none at all.
If we find anything out, we'll come back on that if there is something out there and we find it. We've only got a couple of minutes left, but somebody's asked, are there any negatives about getting a diagnosis? Because potentially, there might be some stigma around this.
It's a really good question. I think it's I'm probably not the best person to answer this because I don't have a diagnosis, but I think for adults, I think when adults get a diagnosis, I think one of two things often happens. I think from my understanding of speaking to adults with DCD, I think the first is that it comes as a bit of a shock, and it alters your sense of identity. It alters your sense of self and who. So I think that can be quite challenging for adults, and or I think it can be quite explanatory. So often adults will say when they get a diagnosis, that explains so much, and I wish I'd known this, kind of 10 years ago, because it would have explained so much, and parents will often say that as well. Or, parents might say when a child gets a diagnosis, you've just described my husband, you've just described, you've just described me when I was a child, kind of thing. So, I don't know, Andrew, what's your experiences?
I think actually I'm probably going to have to draw things to a close, but that was really interesting. I mean, I guess the weight, the preponderance will be to say it's going to be beneficial rather than not to be aware. So, look, massive thank you to our speakers, to Catherine and Jennifer and Andrea. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and understanding and experience. We thank you, the audience, for being with us. As I say, we will follow up as much as we can, answer any questions that are outstanding, and we'll share links and resources as well. You will receive an email in the next few days with a copy of the recording, and also links to register for other forthcoming events. So we do have these events reasonably regularly. If any of you watching would like to get involved with Cardiff University, volunteering time to help our students, or participating in research, or helping us to fundraise for our research, please do follow the link that we're sharing in the comments box. Our next event is taking place on Thursday, the 28th of April. And the showcase then will be our research into cancer immunotherapies, which will be another really interesting one, I'm sure. And we hope you can join us for that. So, diolch yn fawr, a hwyl. Thank you very much, everybody. And goodbye for now. Bye-bye.